All right, welcome back to Side Quest VIII, episode 9. And back with me is my perennial companion and party member, Wes Schantz. Welcome back, Wes. Nice to see you.
Yeah, it's good to see you. How's it going?
It's going well. And so last time we spoke, there must have been some hint of trepidation in our listeners, as well as perhaps in us, if we, like these characters in Final Fantasy VIII, are experiencing some sort of amnesia. What happened to Squall? Is he alive? Are we going to make the transition from disc one to disc two? I'm sure that you recall, and I hope that you recall, the sort of feeling of agony and fear that one had when you get the opportunity to save. There's no save point present. Once in this strange liminal space at the disc change screen, right? Sort of like the Chrono Trigger meeting place of all times, as it were. And then you get the chance to save. Hopefully it works and isn't like that portable save point that one can take down into the crater in Final Fantasy VII that actually corrupts one's file. And
Yes.
then hopefully during the transition from disc one to disc two goes in, it doesn't have any scratches, and the game can start again. Now, obviously, playing in the PS4 with the remastered edition, I didn't have to experience quite so much trepidation because of the physical components of the game. But even still, minding the amnesia, uh, I mean, ostensibly the game could just be over.
Yeah.
And so maybe this is my first question for you, Wes. In the same way that Final Fantasy VII it has what I consider a pretty heavy opening sequence, everything that involved Midgar and Sector 7 and 8 and the falling of the spoiler alert, and the falling of the plate and Don Cornelio and all that goes on down in the brothel. It almost seemed as if, and perhaps to some extent, the Final Fantasy remake substantiates this point. The entire first act of the game could have been a game itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's not even the entirety of the first disc with Final Fantasy VII, which I believe was 3 discs, whereas this Final Fantasy VIII, with all of its CGIs and its character models, is 4 discs. But
Okay.
my first sort of question, in the form of an observation and a précis in some ways, a preamble, is would the first disc have been a game in of itself? And what are we to what should we expect from disc 2 and disc 3? And maybe even if you recall some of your earlier, younger impressions about this time. What did you think had happened? And then perhaps we can jump into the actual gameplay from today.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the length of the game, it's about at 15 hours or so, I think, per disc as a rough estimate for FF7 and 8, as I recall. Um, so 7 is the one that you sort of first do this thing with the disc switches. And so, of course, 8 has to like one up it, right? It has one extra disc even beyond the 3 from 7. Um, and I guess it did feel like in some way each game was almost a series of games as a result. Like the physical discs representing a game, you have 3 or 4 of them at your disposal when you start playing these things. You know you're in for an incredible experience, this epic adventure. It has to be because it's 4 discs long, right? I was underwhelmed when I first played it. I think the whole sequence with the sorceress, um, probably I wasn't able to defeat her. I would guess I probably got killed by her, you know, high level magic attacks, which, as you pointed out last time, they aren't actually that powerful in the scheme of things, but they seem impressive because they have that aga ending. It's almost like a conjugation or something, right? In a foreign language. And as I was playing the next part of the game, then I was probably pretty confused. Like, okay, so now I'm being Laguna again, but in this kind of abandoned house in this empty town. It seems kind of pointless. I was probably wondering what's up with my main party, and kind of, impatient to find out. And so I probably didn't pay that much attention to this other layer of the game. Uh, it didn't have, the same kind of like clear parallels that I'm seeing now with it. It was just like a weird kind of digression. As much as I love the music in the battles are absurdly easy when you're playing as Laguna. And you're able to grow materia, or not materia, sorry, your GFs, right? You're able to sort of like see them gain levels and stuff. But Laguna himself uh, is kind of washed up, right? He's like done being a soldier, as far as we can tell, and is just kind of hanging out. So anyway, that was weird, and I was probably also a little bit annoyed by the prison sequence that immediately follows, because as you might have seen when you were playing it this time, you get kind of stuck. Maybe it makes sense since it's a prison, but you can't save it right away. So if you do keep going after the part where you switch from Laguna to your main party, there's a solid chunk of game there where you're just kind of stuck, either playing or just clicking through to try to get to the next save point. So luckily this time I was, I had time at my disposal. I wasn't like crunched, but I could see that being kind of frustrating whenever that sort of thing used to happen. Now, I mean, for you, I think you don't even have to abide by save points. You can just kind of pause it wherever, right, with the version you're playing. So. Um,
I wish. I do still
oh,
have
you do?
save points.
Oh, okay.
There are a couple quality of life components that I have not mentioned that I can use. One is 3 times speed, which I occasionally use when I'm just trying to run through somewhere, or when I'm in a really repetitive battle, like I've summoned all of my GFs and I just want what's going to happen quicker. Sort of nice. It's a sort of mode that I think kids would like pre-Christmas. But maybe not their parents and grandparents. And so there you go, the differing perceptions of time. The future means differing things for differing people at different stages of their lives. Okay, well, okay. I too wanted to mention that this digression or intermezzo surely frustrated me. And as you mentioned, it is not a singular intermezzo digression. There's the one to Laguna,
Yeah.
but then an additional one to this prison sequence where you mentioned I was fresh off seeing Laguna speaking to Rain and thinking about particular things one learns in the ending of the game regarding their relationship, and it made me feel particularly sentimental towards my wife, and I really wanted to go downstairs and tell her that every day meant the world to me and that I would never take her for granted. But the moment and the feeling passed because of the length of the prison sequence. I just had to keep going, and I couldn't. There was no good time to pause. It really made me think of so many memes that are made at the expense of the millennial generation. That mom, just as soon as I find a save point. I think I seem to recall Final Fantasy X and Kingdom Hearts having some particularly long moments between points too. Kingdom Hearts very famously before the extremely brutally difficult Riku battle that makes people over and over again have to watch a strong and powerful cutscene, but one that one gets sort of sick of after watching over and over and over and over and over again. And I seem to recall Final Fantasy X doing that sort of thing as well at times, particularly in Seymour's home. But okay, so let's talk about these two intermezzos some, because I think we see a couple of our themes really hit on. Again, first and foremost, Laguna finds himself, so I guess this is sort of the summary part, in this idyllic little town called Winhill, where he spent 6 months recovering, but has now been for 2 years, and people are starting to sort of think, might it be time to get back to whatever it is you're doing, either being a world traveling journalist, which is what he's claimed to this woman, Rain, who seems to be the caretaker or mother of this girl named Elone or Elone. The same Elone, one imagines, as was looking at Squall in the very first scenes of the game post its opening CGI,
Right.
And whom we saw again in the battle area, dangerously close to a T-Rex. And so And so we also learn a couple other very curious things. Ward has lost his voice forever, but survived. Kyros seems to be a funny dressing, according to Laguna, which is funny, given his own penchant for dressing in every character in this game's way of dressing, like Squall with his absurd amount of buckles, to nothing. But Kyros is still around and still using his knives, and he comes down to visit Laguna in this place. I should mention that Galbadia's army is still occupying this place, and Laguna still seems to have some sort of rank in it, though he's not active duty. He's in plain clothes. But the soldiers treat him as a comrade, though they refuse to help him fight. That's something else I should mention, that not only is Laguna now called Uncle, as you mentioned in the pre-show by Elena, and seeming to work for this reign, his job fairies in today, so they're going to be especially strong because they're going to have the GFs and strength of every one of my characters. At one point, Laguna had 6 GFs junction to him, and he was really quite a studly Laguna for a little while, and then he had to split those with Kyros.
Yeah.
Something I should mention about the location is remembering Brothers in the Labyrinth and the sort of legendary mythical feel of that, in contrast to the usual sort of steampunk feel of this game, which we do get a couple CGIs in the prison that are very steampunk. This city of Winhill is far more traditional RPG, not in that it has enemies in it like Zozo from Final Fantasy VI, which is frustrating, and Laguna even mentions to these soldiers, why don't you guys help? And they say, we're just here on guard duty. But the lighting in the houses, one can walk into the houses, and maybe that's something we can talk about someday, that pre-adulthood, perhaps homes are just open to children in some ways, in ways that they aren't just open to adults who must come bearing gifts in a zinnia sort of way, to avoid xenophobia, and to be hospitable. But the lighting in these houses, there's a lot of light. Reminds me a lot of the temple. I'm forgetting the name in Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, but the temple where the Master Sword is, with light coming in. It's very sort of heavenly, and idyllic, and reminiscent of sort of an Edenic first home, like a Nibelheim. In Final Fantasy VII to some extent, or even a Kong, even though I think both of those cities were rebuilt by Shenra, at least one of them. So there's that little bit of irony right there in Final Fantasy VII. But this city itself seems like a prototypical RPG beginning city, and also has the sort of light symbolism that one would expect in the opening city of a sort of Bildungsroman sort of RPG, like coming to consciousness. Wake up, Link. It's time to go. Or wake up, Squall. In this case, it's time to go. And in medias res. But there are monsters in the city too, as well as the Galbadian army. And so, like with the S-Star sort of mine situation, where there was clearly more than met the eye, and we're just swept along in the narrative of this character we barely understand, which I think is also what's happening with the actual narrative in Squall, but even more openly here. There's some strange stuff going on here. Last thing I'll mention is that we find out that Julia has remarried after her true love never returned. Very Odyssey-like in that way. So in the same way that I see Homer in using these masterful digressions, in the same way that he'll talk about a young man's jaw being, say, knocked out of his face right before he dies, but then comparing him to like a tree and how a tree falls in the wind, just to then mention his jaw, flying through the air as his spirit flies the other way. So here do we get a Homeric element or in contrast of the sailor who doesn't make it home, and the wife who does, or the woman who does move on, and moves on to Renoa's father, suggesting to us that perhaps Julia is the mother of Renoa and General Caraway the father, which we already know. And then we see very curiously Laguna and this Rain, who we're not yet ready to say have some sort of relationship, but there is some indication that there could be something there, though Laguna's character is one that seems a little bit non-committal to all those around him. Are his dreams real? Will he pursue them? Will he stay in this boring town, as the old woman mentions, that one gets that in the middle of the town one can access her building? She says, it seems sort of boring for you here. And so what is Laguna doing here? Even Kiro says, what are you doing here? Are you going to, keep this up for very long? And so it seems like Laguna needs to make some sort of choice: be a soldier, stay there, although one wonders about that option, or go be a journalist like he's told everybody. And I think that's probably enough summary for now. We can get into the actual prison and the Seeper and the torture and these Moombas afterwards.
Yeah. No, yeah, they're clearly distinct yet paired scenes here, right? So off the high of the end of disc 1 to this very sedate opening of disc 2, and then we jump back into the prison stuff going on. But I wanted to point out the intrigue here does seem to be finding out that fact about what happened to Julia, and that's in the course of a kind of dialogue set of options.
Yes.
Where you can find out what's going on with Ward, right? He never got his voice, he's working in the prison. You can find out what's going on with yourself, right? But that's that grayed out option, right? And if you ask, where am I? It's sort of not Laguna's voice asking it. It's the dreamer, whoever that is, right? Presumably Squall. It seems like he's most connected with Laguna. And so that sort of raises this question for the characters themselves. They're like, the fairies are talking, right? And so there's this sense that they're aware that they are being observed, which I don't think was really present before. I think in the last one, we didn't even really see any of those grayed out options, or at least not many of them. And then there's also like the parenthetical dialogue that Laguna has with the little girl, Elone, right? So they sort of have their fairy-ish conversation that happens sotto voce, right? In these hushed tones. Because Elone, he's very openly affectionate with. And yet with Rain, he has this odd kind of standoffishness. He's a little bit awkward, especially talking about Julia in front of her, right? And she seems kind of oblivious that of course, he's the one who left her, right? And of course, she turns out to have married General Caraway and to be the mother of our other love interest character. And yeah, the Homeric thing was making me think like, what Kiros is doing here is a lot like when Hermes comes to Odysseus on the island at the start of the book, right? And he's calling him back into action, where maybe he could stay with Calypso and be content there. But knowing his character, of course, that can't be the way the story goes. He has to return. And so this is kind of that moment of the psychopomp who appears, and there is this amazing light and beauty of this town, and yet it's not proper for our hero to stay here. I think we also get the first indications that there are chocobos in this world. Of course, there's chocobos. It's a Final Fantasy, but we see there's like signs, like a chocobo crossing, and like some posters and things around. So it has that strange kind of idyllic, bucolic atmosphere to it. And yet, in the town, it's an encampment of soldiers. You can't go into most of the buildings; they're off limits. There are monsters, and all the young men, all the fighting age people have gone to war, right? So the war is still going on, and it's apparently quite serious. There's bullet holes in the wall, right? And he's like pretty concerned for Elone going out on her own. They kind of make it into a game, but it's clear that it is dangerous for a little girl, because Rain is quite upset that she was outside, and she talks in this very cutesy voice with Laguna, but at the same time, he is a guy with a machine gun. Like he's not messing around, and so he sort of has set up himself as this hero in a very small pond, right?
Mm-hmm.
His job is to go back and forth mowing down these low-level monsters day after day for years. He's been here doing this. And so it is kind of like a microcosm of the classic like level up and grind RPG, right? A Dragon Quest kind of RPG.
Hmm.
And it's not sufficient. Like we know this is not how this is supposed to go. We know there's supposed to be more than this. We are impatient for it to happen. And again, Kiros is kind of voicing that as well. It's like, what are you? Yeah, exactly. What are you doing here, Laguna? And so we could think of it in terms of a kind of shell shock or trauma, right? That he's sort of processing still what he's gone through. We could think of it as him trying to avoid his destiny, right? He's maybe afraid of failing, afraid of what might happen if he does try to go and talk to Julia, right? We saw this already. He was really nervous about even talking to her. Turns out her song was about him, right? The Eyes on Me song that she's gotten famous for is a love song. And the lyrics, if you look them up, they're about how he was watching her, but she was looking at him too. And so there's this interesting perspective thing again, the eyes always getting focused on, right? We see Squall's eye, we see the statue's eye, we see Adea's face up close in her eyes. Yeah, and the idea of like what these characters are able to see versus what they don't know about, right? There's that irony of we as a player have seen the most of what's going on, maybe with the exception of a few people like Sid or the sorceress. Laguna seems to know that the sorceress is probably looking for a successor, right? She might capture Elone, who I think we've been told at this point, I'm not sure, has some sort of maybe magical powers or something that makes her of interest to the sorceress and her army. So yeah, there's a lot. There's a tiny piano in the room. It's sort of like a child's room where he's sleeping. So there's that little echo of his love with Julia. But again, it's on this like other scale of a child's toy. Um, and when you finally do go back, and you're gonna go to sleep, he expresses some angst that he'll wake up somewhere else. So it turns out again he's been seeing what's going on the flip side as much as we've been seeing what's going on with him. There's a connection that's bi-directional here, and he's very afraid that he will lose track of his real quote unquote life and the people he cares about, especially Elena, um, and be kind of you know carried away in the ships of the Phaeacians or whatever it is, off to another adventure. Or um, maybe he's afraid of finding out too much about who these people are and what that means about his future. He doesn't seem to want to know. He doesn't want to confront it.
That's interesting that you compare this island to something like an Ogygia where
There it is.
Calypso
Yeah.
is, and where Odysseus spends 7 years sort of outside of the scope of normal time, in mythic time rather than, say, human time.
Yeah.
And that Hermes is sent down um, by Zeus at the imploring of Athena to let Calypso know the bad news that he's got to go. And it does seem like Kiros here really is that bad news, saying, in the same way that Mercury also comes down to Carthage, perhaps even more so, like Mercury coming down to Carthage with the incipient romance between Dido and Aeneas, though perhaps with a different determination. Though perhaps all love suffers from the same termination in the end. But in any case, I wanted to mention to your idea that perhaps Laguna is traumatized, and perhaps there's a parallel to the sort of trauma that Squall has just experienced, suffering what must have been a major violent wound in battle after risking his life, and also facing his brother-like former sort of friend who will in fact say that who will be torturing him in just a moment, and we'll get to on sort of a cross, while wearing white, while Squall wears black, while having blonde hair and sort of and blonde short hair, and Squall has this like brown long hair and this sort of liquid and solid snake contrast. One wonders whether the trauma that Laguna is feeling, might be paralleled and compounded by the trauma that Squall, who seems to have some relationship to this Laguna, has, by the fact that in this, like we've mentioned, idyllic town that it really seems like Laguna needs to get going from, there's this sort of inappropriate children's music on. This strange, repetitive, evocative song that is only replaced by the really cool techno fairies sort of Laguna battle music. The Laguna has his own battle music, not the same battle music as Squall and company, and that gives us a short reprieve from this music. But like you said, the fact that he's in a bed and in a room that is made for a child, that he is not following his stated ambitions nor returning to the military, that this whole city seems like it is, say, maybe the starting point for a different main character, like Elene, for example. That perhaps this is her starting point for her journey, but that Laguna is a man out of a place and time here, like Aeneas in Carthage, like Odysseus in Ithaca, and perhaps and sadly like Link in the amongst the Deku people, amongst the sort of elves in the initial forest. As we find out, these are not his people, and he must leave an age. So I think the Jungians might suggest that this is something called in French a reduction de niveau mental, like a reduction of the mental level in response to a traumatic experience. So in a similar way to us being shot out of this futuristic steampunk narrative into a legendary space to confront the brothers, so here do we find ourselves now shot back into sort of a, like you said, an ordinary or more traditional Dragon Quest-esque Legend of Legaia, Chrono Cross opening village sequence where we do not belong. And it is clear that we don't belong and can't stay. Not only as the fairies who only temporarily get to interact in Laguna's life, but as Laguna himself in this space. He needs to make a choice. He needs to move on. This is a pivotal moment in his life, and just to connect this is also when we, right after this sequence, realize that there is in fact a connection between Laguna and his characters and our characters. Apparently Zell has been inhabiting Ward, and this has made his most recent venture into the fairies very boring, because we wake up and there's no Squall. There's Quistis, Selphie, and Zell. It's actually really disappointing. Zell, of all people. The chicken wuss that Seifer calls him. Hard to see him as quite a stud, but he was not occupying Kyros, nor was he occupying Laguna, again suggesting that Squall is alive. And spoiler, we will in a moment, though not quite yet, find out that he is when we see him being tortured by Seifer, another reduction in Seifer's character, now morally rather than just physically, though he now has an inflated impression of who he is. But it turns out that Zell got to be Ward, but this was boring because Ward now works as a janitor at a prison. But this is apropos and helpful because Ward has been working as a prison guard at this prison, where Selphie, Quistis, a Squall, as it turns out, all these really attractive moodles that look a little like Red 13, and I guess are a version of Mogs in this playthrough. And so we not only have evidence of chocobos, but also some sort of Mog-like thing. But apparently we have been occupying characters who occupy the same world that we occupy. Ward lives in the same world as Zell. Whether it's the same time or not, that seems unlikely and is a question. but not only do we now see a little bit more of what's going on familially with General Caraway, who literally carries away Julia and Renoa, but now we have Laguna, LNA, and Rain. This means something, and Laguna happens to be the character that Squall embodies. Also very funny, given their very differing personalities. One so taciturn, and one so ebullient. But what did you think about the fact that when we wake up, again, another digression, we don't have Squall. We still don't know whether Squall is alive, but we soon find out that Zell's boring experience as ward is invaluable experience, and this teaches us in sort of the opposite from in our last playing. We realized we didn't know what we thought we knew in the game. Our power was not up to snuff. The political situation has changed. The sorceress seems to have some sort of gift that we don't even know how to deal with. But now we're seeing that we do know. We're learning a little bit more about social familial relationships, and perhaps their political implications, and also this strange connection between our main characters and their iterations as fairies with Laguna, Kiros, and Ward.
Yeah, yeah. I was struck by the way that Zell is sort of weirdly the leader during this section, right? Shouldn't it be Quistis or maybe Renoa, right? They
Right.
outrank him, I would think. Um, and and so it's kind of funny that, he's so uh, obtuse about like Renoa basically has to like lead him to the realization that what he just dreamt is relevant. um, you know, she kind of acts as like a Socratic figure here, like asking him the question until he realizes it for himself, and then he gets pretty jazzed about it, right? He also realizes like, oh, like they don't have their weapons, but I have my fists. These are my weapons right here, and and the irony there, of course, is that none of that matters because for some reason they still have all their GFs, they have all their magic, they have all their items. All that's been taken away are the weapons, which really don't make that much difference in the scheme of things, but whatever, fine. Um, I also thought it was kind of cool, just the visual juxtaposition of Winhill, the beautiful town with all the flowers, the amazing architecture, the light. And then we come to this like techno hell of the prison, which is very vertical, right? And Winhill was very expansive, broad, open. And here we're sort of, appropriately um, boxed in and stuck, and everything is about ups and downs rather than going out. And the colors, right? So like the flowers of Winhill, the only thing that we have that's remotely like that, as you point out, are the characters themselves, their outfits. So Quistis, Selphie, Renoa are kind of these primary colors, very bright against the drab background. But of course, Zell and Squall are both wearing dark clothes. They hardly show up at all. And we haven't seen Irving. We don't know what happened to Irving. If he's here with them, he's not present. But I think you can deduce that he must be the one who was dreaming Kiros, because none of the others seem to have been in the dream. Squall was, of course, Laguna, we assume. Zell was Ward. So by process of elimination, Irving must have participated in the dream as Kiros, which is kind of interesting to think about. And his absence is conspicuous here. It might make us suspect him a little bit, right, of being a double agent. Maybe, he was not on our team the whole time. But anyway, yeah, so we sort of get caught up to speed a little bit. They're like having a chance to kind of process what's going on. As usual, they're sort of asking like, what are these dreams? But as usual, they're not actually delving into the possibilities of what they could mean. They have no, more insight than they ever did. And then it cuts kind of abruptly over to Squall. He's in solitary confinement. He seems to have healed, and he doesn't understand, which is weird, right? We see Selphie trying to like use a cure spell, and there's some kind of like anti-magic field going on. So whatever they did, they must have done it before he was brought here, and it appears that this is the first he's woken up. So maybe not that much time has passed, but it's unclear. And of course, we get this crazy FMV sequence. This movie thing of the little chamber being picked up by some monstrous elevator machine and like zoomed up to the top floor, up into the darkness.
Very like The Matrix, which I think came
Yeah,
out a year later. The sequence
Absolutely.
where Neo has his pod taken by one of the machines and deposited in another area. They were
Exactly.
very similar.
It's exactly, and the sort of faceless guards, very much in that vein as well, right? They're not wearing military uniforms, but they're clearly uh, just interchangeable in the same way that the military of Galbadia are. Um, the only one who's like identified is the mean guy, who apparently we can tell just based on his voice is um, sort of stands out by how crude and and awful he is. Um, he starts beating up on them, and then yeah, the Moombas similarly are going to come in for punishment here. Their their existence in this world is a like a mystery to us. Like we don't know what they are or why they're being used as servants in this prison. Um,
Laguna, Laguna.
they know his name, and they seem to know that Squall is linked in some way with Laguna. Yeah, yeah. So it's pretty wild.
Yeah, no, so yeah, so as questions are answered, more questions arise. Where are we? Where's Irving and what's he doing? And was he a double agent? And is that why he was so inadequate to the task? Or was it that we were set up for failure and he wasn't a double agent? But yeah, where is he? And does he have some special punishment because he's the one who took the shot?
Mm.
One wonders because it would seem that Squall has pretty special punishment. And so now in this very Cain and Abel way, we have Squall placed in sort of crucifix fashion with his arms raised out and his legs beneath him, and he's being electrocuted at Seifer's whim, while Seifer says some very curious things to him. I shared, or we both took some pictures of curious scenes, but one thing I wanted to mention was Seifer's, and speaking of dramatic irony, his perception of the situation between them.
Mm.
So, on the one hand, yes, he says, but since I like you so much, I thought you should go first with the punishment. This is, again, a very Odysseus sort of moment, in the same way that Polyphemus says that his guest gift to Odysseus will be to eat him last, so that he can watch all of his men get eaten in front of him. So does Seifer decide to torture Squall first because he likes him so much. But two things he says. Well, let's maybe say three. First and foremost, what is it that he's asking from Squall? He's asking him what the meaning of seed is. And Squall says, what do you mean? You're practically as much a seed as I am. You should know. And Seifer says, I'm not a seed, though. You are. And so there must be some secret they tell you. So maybe Sid was getting prepared to tell Squall and Selfie some secret before he was interrupted by the garden instructor, but he did not. So we do have some hint that there may be some sort of secret. And Idea apparently does not like the seeds and wants to fight against them. And a second thing about Seifer is now it looks like he's going to be something like a Nazi. He is going to be used as a bloodhound to track down all of these characters. This reminds one of Hans Landa from Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, who was a character who was himself given the task of hunting down, the certain segment of the population that the Nazis wanted to hunt down at that time. It seems like the seeds are now going to be hunted down. But Seifer's own perception of himself is that he is fulfilling his childhood dream of becoming a sorceress's knight, which one wonders whether this is a childhood dream or a childish dream, like we just saw in Winhill. Is this a reduction of the mental level back to a childish level? And then he says that he frames the story. And again, so is Elene a main character in Winhill? And is that the opening city that she finds herself in? What is Laguna doing there? This character who's not the main character in that world or in that space, or even in the game that he's being played in, right? Squall is the protagonist, not Laguna. But Seifer yet gives another perspective. The tale of the evil mercenary, Squall, versus the sorceress's knight. Though Squall says Seifer, you're just a torturer now.
Mhm.
So this relationship that I suggested was like a brotherly relationship, but was moving in the opposite direction of the brothers GF that we see in this legendary maze-like labyrinthine space. These brothers, if you defeat one of them, the older one, then the battle ends. And even when they are summoned together, they're summoned together and they fight together. Well, in the opening CGI of this game, we saw some conflict between Seifer and Squall, but a connection too, because even when one gets scarred on the face by one, so does the other. There's something, they're like blood brothers in that respect. They're joined by their scars, another Odyssey sort of moment, you might say, or sharing visible wounds that connect them together. But here, Seifer, is he further reduced from being basically a weakling when fighting for Idea, seemingly suggesting a reduction not only in his mental level, but his physical level, giving up his training and just, really returning to the imagination like a great athlete who hasn't competed for a few months, goes to a competition and is like, I believed things about myself that were entirely untrue. I was not nearly as capable as I thought myself to be. But is he, in being drawn perhaps into this sort of realm of darkness or into the imagination or into the depths of the unconscious, away from, say, away from a path that he can represent honestly to himself, is he weakening physically and morally? Does he think he has the high ground on Squall, even morally, even though physically, in a physical portrayal, Squall is literally above Seifer, but it is Seifer who is calling the shots at this particular moment. So, and so what do you, the relationship, how that relates to the end of this one, whether you connect that to the Brothers GF and the Labyrinth that we just recently saw, and the recent sort of break or fissure or diverge in the paths that both Seifer and Squall have been walking.
I see something maybe else to mention here, which is the loneliness of the two of them, right? Laguna just was found by a friend who came looking for him, right? And Squall is about to be found by his friends coming to look for him. And we last heard from Fujin and Raijin, right, back in the Galbadia garden, saying, we're going to go find him. Now, either they got sidetracked or he was too inaccessible for them, or possibly they did come to him and he rejected them. It's unclear. We don't know yet what's going on with that little side quest. But it strikes me that he's alone here. He's not in the company of the sorceress. He's acting kind of as her lieutenant, it seems like. And he's acting foolishly, right? He is allowing himself to be kind of steered by his own passions here. It's interesting that he appears to be completely uninterested in Renoa, right? After their fling a few years ago, whatever it was, he doesn't even mention her. He does say the friends are here, but he doesn't single out any of them. And well, he does Zell, right? He thinks Zell is pretty despicable and calls him by that very rude name. And yeah, he seems to really enjoy sadistically, right, the torture of his great rival, who just wiped the floor with him when they actually fought at the parade, right? That's got to sting. So it's pretty amusing in that regard. And Squall has some options eventually, right? Because it turns out that they're going to fire missiles and blow up the garden, supposedly. So Squall can lie and just say something about what the seed secret meaning is. And he says, if you choose that option, something about how they're going to spread flowers throughout the world. So again, this like callback to Winhill, something kind of amusing that he's just sort of winging in that moment. But I guess the more canonical or like the proper thing to do in that situation is for him to just stoically accept the torture. And so it is weird, like it seems almost more like if you ever watched The Princess Bride, right? There's that torture machine that's just like a pain deliverer. It doesn't exactly map onto a crucifixion because the aim is not to kill the person, although it is to, make them as sort of humble as possible, right? As discredited as, um, uh, you know, just as treated them as horribly as possible. Um, but it's not to kill him, right? They do need information from him, and his death is not immediately uh, uh, like their goal. So it has this strange quality of like a totally gratuitous delivery of pain. Um, and Squall seems to be able to accept that, right? He doesn't uh, lose his kind of noble composure up there, but he does lose consciousness a few times. And so in a way, he triumphs here. Seifer has to go away kind of without getting anything from him. And and meanwhile, his friends are wiping the floor with the guards. There's just no contest. Um, the guards are like waving around the weapons, very um, oblivious to to the fact that Zell is there and his weapons are attached to him, right? And he's got a Moomba for company, although the Moomba doesn't participate in the battle. Um, the
Disappointing.
Yeah, I know it's sort of like, come on, it does look kind of like a Red 13.
Got
Also,
thoughts.
we run into Biggs and Wedge, and so
Yes. Yes.
there's another callback there. It's a lot like in the Star Wars films where they talk about going and destroying all the Jedi, right? So there's a almost a one-to-one reference there with the Star Wars character names. Um,
I was
going
going
and
to ask you about that. I see a lot of Star Wars in this, and Seifer being sort of a Darth Vader
yeah,
figure, right? He's a knight, and thinking about even sort of like the power structure of the rule of two with Sith, right? Like there's
yes,
sort of a grand mage and sort of the knight, the squire, Sancho
exactly.
and Don Quixote sort of thing going on. But even though there's sort of a noble prestige to the titles, the the aim is not, well, one wonders whether it's noble or not, and whether a noble aim is necessarily a moral aim. But yeah, we even find ourselves in this prison that seems itself modeled to some extent off of the prison from a new Star Wars, A New Hope.
Hmm.
um uh
So
and maybe just the whole techno steampunk thing too. Sorry, go.
yeah, no, I'm looking back at the screens for this, right? It's just kind of um it's kind of silly because when Zell gets back and delivers the weapons, each of the characters has this like huge version of them that like pops up. So there is something bizarre and fantastical going on there, and even the Moomba gets to do it, even though he's not participating in the battles, right? And that's immediately before Biggs and Wedge show up, who are just as weak as ever, and yet have some amazing spells that you can draw from them.
Haste,
Things that,
slow,
yeah, that buff you.
protect.
It's crazy. So the fight is really just a chance to goof around and draw magic. Um, but it's also like they recognize your party too, right? So there's this hilarious moment where they're like, well, at least they don't have their weapons, but of course you've just like become as confident as is possible to be with the delivery of the weapons. So there's this crazy, yeah, there's this turning of the tables. Um, the elevating of Squall to torture him, of course, is just morally elevating him. He's never been more heroic than in that moment. Seifer has never been more classically villainous. Um, he's been kind of a bully, but he's never descended to such depths to this point. He's apparently going to murder all of the people in his former home with these missiles. It's just like Doctor Evil, like it's out of control. But of course, that's not going to happen, right? I mean, we're going to save the day. We know that our team is unstoppable. Um, we didn't get any boss battles with Laguna, which I found kind of interesting. Um, it just sort of, ends. You fight as many battles as you want, and then it switches back to this. But then we get a boss battle pretty much right away with our main characters. So it just in terms of like the beats of the story, it's interesting that they're sort of structured that way. um, and the kind of, eavesdropping that's happening when we're in the Laguna dreams. We have to sort of assume, I guess, that Laguna is present in some sense, watching what's going on with Squall, and maybe that's what the Moombas are tuning into there, um, because uh, that was the last thing we heard from him before he went to sleep, was that he was worried about just such a thing happening.
And I mean, perhaps even us, we go to sleep as eighth graders, we wake up as we are now and
Old.
playing the same game.
Mhm.
Can you play the same game twice though? Just two sort of finalish reflections based on what you said. Something interesting that I note about what you're mentioning in terms of juxtaposing Laguna and Squall in this moment is that they both find themselves in limbo, in a limbic sort of space that is only changed into a space of sort of energeia or motion, sort of Aristotelian actuality motion, rather than just stasis, by a hermetic character. Right? Laguna has been in stasis for about 18 months, hasn't been able to make a decision, probably because there's this new person in his life. This is mentioned over and over by Kiros that he's changed. And why does he even care about where he wakes up if he's this sort of man about town, man about the world who wants to get about? And why does he care about this young girl and this woman and seemingly this boring town? Because of it. And so this mercurial hermetic character Kiros, this friend, has to come and boom, in a Newtonian way, add motion back to Laguna's life. In the same way, Squall here, Mr. I can do it myself. Mr. I don't want to rely on anybody, is himself literally going to be suspended in air, and will rely on the help not only of his friends, but of these creatures that may have some sort of friendly familial relationship to him too. They call him Laguna for some odd reason. And so both of these characters find themselves, and I think this is very striking given the several juxtapositions we've made, that going from a moment of tremendous climax in the story where we are moving forward the action. I literally, again, and used correctly, Squall has to run forward and then jump in a car and move forward and then break through these gates. It's exciting. But now he is physically suspended in a place where magic doesn't work, a place of sort of pure, sort of evil, Rocky IV Soviet technology / Star Wars. Sometimes these techno environments are representative of sort of a diminution of the soul of the people, that they've become purely scientific, like the dark side sort of aesthetic, maybe the Blade Runner aesthetic to some extent. And so in this prison where magic literally can't even be used, there's third use of literally correctly too, I'll mention, until the anti-magic field is lifted so that the characters can then use magic again. But I want to mention this shift from our two main characters generating the action, Laguna, who Kiros even mentions, how could I stay away from this guy? My whole life is, following his hijinks around. And Rain says, I understand what you mean. That he's usually pushing the action forward, and that Squall wants to be totally self-determined. But we don't even, as the sort of Squall to his Laguna, as the fairies to his self, we don't even get to play as him. We get to choose a couple speech options at one point, but we must play as his friends effectively, and in order to get back to him, in order to put him back in the driver's seat. And this is something Final Fantasy does very well. Final Fantasy VI, not starting with our protagonists like Terra, but in the world of Ruin in the second part of that game. But then here in this second part, not only are we disoriented, but our main characters are no longer even the vehicles of action, are not even driving the narrative forward at this point. Our one is passively receiving punishment, and the other is passively refusing to make a very necessary decision. So much so that it's almost as if the gods of the video game developers, must send these hermetic characters to introduce motion back into their lives. I did have a second point I wanted to make about being magnified by violence, uh, but I think that's probably actually my better point. So I'll stick with that one and see what you have to think about that as we conclude.
No, I mean, I just think it's very bold of them to enlarge the character sprites to that degree, because the closer you look at them, the weirder they look. It's sort of absurd, just in that way as well. But yeah, no, for sure. The weird thing about this part of the game, though, is that you might have the half encounter or even no encounter abilities from Diabolos. If you've been learning them, you can turn off encounters. So you fight nothing except bosses for the rest of the game. It's a way to basically play a non-violent run of the game, and you can probably do fine if you're strategic about how you set up for all those battles, if you know what's going on. Um, the the last sort of point of comparison I think here that I always like to bring up is Xenogears, though, because Xenogears has a portion late in the game where the characters are all put up on kind of cross cruciform, torture devices. Their giant gears are, that is. And the silly thing about that is that one of the characters doesn't have a gear but just enlarges, and it's basically a stuffed animal looking thing. And so this stuffed animal raised up on the cross, like huge, is suffering for the sins of the many in Xenogears. And it's a very similar kind of deal where you have this kind of techno dystopia feel. So I got to imagine that was somewhere in the background of this portion of the game. There's a
Could you say
sequence.
the first part again really quickly, Wes? Maybe the recording got it, but it didn't come through on my end.
Oh, just the thing about Xenogears being another point of comparison here.
Yes.
Yeah, just that in that game, very famously late in the game, all of the characters are crucified, not themselves directly, but in their giant mechs. And so you have the sequence of all of them on the field of Golgotha. It's even called Golgotha, being hanged, and one of them is a stuffed animal looking creature who gets giant sized and doesn't use a gear as a result. So she is just there being crucified. It's one of the most absurd things in a very absurd genre that you'll run across. And that game, I think, has got to be an influence here as well, with the prison and the crucifixion and all this stuff. So there's some, I mean, mythological stuff, but also just generic or genre related stuff that's happening here that is the magnification of violence, and also the undercutting of that for comedic and sort of borderline irreverent, or sacrilegious effect. And this would never have flown with Nintendo, but of course this is Sony, so it's fine.
Yeah, Sony and Squaresoft. What I was going to say about that, and I'll let you go right now because I know you have time constraints.
No, that's fine. Yeah.
Was that in the same way that we were disoriented by Idea's easy disposal of us, even after we defeated her in combat, disoriented so much that we might question how much more powerful have we become by this point at the end of Disc 1 compared to at the beginning of Disc 1. And Biggs and Wedge are a nice reminder that actually, in fact, and when our weapons are returned to us, and this says something about our sort of inner gear or specific difference as mercenaries, that it's like we become more ourselves. We're magnified who we truly. It's like we become ourselves again as characters, or now we enter the stage again, because we're not only just this named person, but now the character who wields the force of this character in terms of personality, but also physical force. But also we're reminded that though the world may be more expansive and have creatures far more powerful than we would have ever expected, we have made real progress. Biggs and Wedge are scared of us. They are afraid. They're like, what's under Lieutenant? They know that they're going to lose to us. And so there's a sense of confidence and pride that is restored to us as well, that actually, you're getting your GS back, you're getting your ability to use magic back, you're getting your weapons back, you're getting your feet back under you. And actually, you're not as weak as maybe you might have judged yourself to be after this confrontation with Idea and this loss of your weapons and your ability to use magic and your ability to even move the narrative forward. These are quickly returned to us, as well as the knowledge that we have made progress, that we may not have been at the end of the game like we might have expected at the end of disc 1. We may still be at the beginning of things, but this beginning is a new beginning, a new hope. It's not the first beginning. And so we haven't gone all the way back to square one. We're on a new square, but it's a new square. It's a new beginning, not just the first beginning. And I think that is a good place to be at the inception of disc 2.
Yes, totally. Yeah. So for next time we hopefully escape the prison. I don't know how long this place is, but. Whew.
I don't want to be in prison too much longer either, myself having had to really struggle to find that, I think, 12th floor save point that I definitely had to save at before I risked some gil to play against the card player that you have to risk gil to play against. And so I hope you crushed it.
I'm sure that it will be no challenge at all.
Yeah. All right. Well, my friend, I hope you have a wonderful day. I'm looking forward to talking through this with you again next week. And listeners, keep listening because we're getting to the good stuff now.
Yeah. Sounds good. Take care.